Welcome, everyone, to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, as tonight we present the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations by Daniel Yergin. This book is quoted and described by the London Sunday Times as a wonderful book on the transformation of the global map of power and wealth that has happened in the 21st century. Read this to find out what's really happening. Wisdom remains a rare commodity as it ever was, end quote. And also the USA Today says, and I quote, at a time when solid facts and reasoned arguments are in retreat, Daniel Yergin rides to the rescue. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author and the energy savant is armed to the teeth. Yergin provides an engaging survey of the lifeblood of modern civilization, where the world has been and where it's likely headed, end quote. These two quotes are amazing and just fulfills exactly what the new map was going to provide. So let's get into tonight's discussion, shall we? Tonight our discussion will focus on energy and the geopolitical challenges that face us on the eve of our country's 2020 elections. I'm Marian Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Thank you for joining us this evening. And a special thanks to all our guests and members that have supported tonight's program. Before we begin, let me tell you about a few of our upcoming programs that we have for you. Tomorrow, we have a special VIP exclusive with our council cabinet members, where I'll be sharing the council's plans for the next few months. Then on Friday, we continue our Friday lunchtime series entitled Global Connections, featuring a conversation on the recent resignation of Japan's Prime Minister. Then next week, we have another amazing lineup for you. First, we have a special reveal just for you. The Council is honored to introduce a documentary on the extraordinary works of legendary Life magazine photographer, council cabinet member, and longstanding friend of the World Affairs Council, Mr. Bob Gomel. I know many of you are familiar with his photographs, so tune in to hear the stories behind the pictures. Also next week, we have programs on cybersecurity, the Council's Local to Global Young Professional Program, and then back to another lunchtime Global Connections program. And as always, if you miss any of these exciting webinars or online discussions, you can find all of them, including our recent conversation with former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, former Senator Kirk Watson, and Judge Douglas Ginsburg, all on our World Affairs Council YouTube channel. So check out our channel and you'll see all of the programs that we have there. Now it's my honor to open our program with Daniel Yergin on the new map. Joining the Council's Ronan O'Malley, who will take our questions tonight, it is my distinct honor to introduce our World Affairs Council board member and moderator for today's discussion. An experienced energy professional in his own right, and someone who's worked all over the world, Vice President of Global Affairs at ConocoPhillips, John DeBar. John is responsible for the government affairs for ConocoPhillips in DC, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. I guess he's a little busy. And in addition to leading their federal and state government affairs team, he's responsible for local stakeholder relations, including interactions with elected and appointed government officials and civil society and NGO engagement at the grassroots level. John also oversees ConocoPhillips' public policy function, interacting with environmental, social, and governance-focused investors, shareholder and governance experts, and their social license to operate. Joining John, our guest tonight, is a familiar face to many here in Houston. Pulitzer Prize-winning and best-selling author Daniel Yergin is a highly respected authority on energy, international politics, and economics. He's vice chairman of IHS Markit, one of the leading information and research firms in the world, a member of the Board of Council of Foreign Relations, a senior trustee of the Brookings Institution, and has served on the Secretary Energy Advisory Board under the last 4 presidential administrations. often seen published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times on energy history and economy. He's authored and co-authored several books on energy, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Prize, and also The Quest, both of which I found interesting that were drafted in longhand. Will you please join me in welcoming back to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston our special guests this evening, Mr. Daniel Yergin and our John DeBar. Dan, John, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Marianne. Dan, it's always great to see you again. Had a great chance to read your book over the weekend. Fascinating story, great writing. Highly recommended that all of our listeners read your book. So let's go right into some questions. We'll start out with some easy ones. So mustard or mayo?
Mustard, of course.
Suit or jeans?
It depends.
All right. Voting booth or absentee?
Probably absentee.
All right. Prius or Tesla?
Neither.
And now get more serious. Energy, dark skies or blue?
Bluish.
So let we're in Houston and we're at the World Affairs Council. So let's talk a little bit about how the unconventional revolution in the U.S. Has had both impacts on the U.S. economy and then on geopolitical positions and strengthened the country's foreign policy options.
Right. I think that the shale revolution really has been a revolution, and I think that the total impacts is not very well recognized. Obviously, Houston, Texas recognizes it, but what it's meant for manufacturing, what it's meant for over $200 billion of investment in new factories, what it's meant for the balance of payments, what it's meant for government revenues, what it's meant for jobs. But I think even less well recognized is what it's meant for the position of the United States in the world, what it's meant for our foreign policy. And there it has been a very big positive. Other countries see that. It's just not so well recognized in our own country.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question about what it's done for jobs in the U.S. So, part of the economic benefits have come from cheaper gas for manufacturing and petrochemicals. What are some of the things you've seen that cheap gas in the U.S. Has made it improve from a business climate?
Well, it's been I have some statistics in the book, although the book's not a statistics book, about how much of fixed business investment has been related to the shale revolution, and it's a very substantial part of that that's gone into it. These are things that are just not well recognized, and the jobs are not just here. One of my favorite numbers is from the work that we did, that the state of New York bans shale gas and shale drilling, but there are over 40,000 jobs in New York State that result from the existence of the shale revolution. So every state in the country virtually has benefited from it.
I read that with a lot of pleasure, seeing that there were those many jobs, and I've seen that in my own work, Dan.
Well, John, you see it in government relations. I mean, when Marianne went through I guess you don't have the Northeast, so you don't have to deal so much with that. But I've just been really struck as I've been on my virtual book tour by kind of the misunderstanding of the significance of what shale has meant for the United States and the kind of myths and emotions that surround it in some parts of the country. One other area that's really interesting is how shale gas, LNG, pipeline configurations have also had effects internationally. For example, diversifying the European gas market, buyers and sellers no longer tied to long-term contracts. How do you see this influencing the overall balance of gas in Europe, the different sellers, the different new market entrants, and long-term sellers like Russia? Well, since you mentioned Russia, I'll begin with a story about Russia. I was at an event in St. Petersburg, and the two speakers were Vladimir Putin and Chancellor Merkel of Germany. And I was given the opportunity to ask the first question, and it was directed to Vladimir Putin about what are you going to do about diversifying your economy so you're not so over-dependent on oil and gas. And by accident, I said the magic word shale, and he erupted in anger and started shouting at me in front of like 3,000 people. And what he was shouting at me about is that he really doesn't like shale for two reasons. One, it affects the market position of Russia as a seller of gas to Europe. And two, he doesn't like it because he sees shale as a bolsterer, an adjunct to support
to U.S. foreign policy, giving the U.S. more flexibility in the world than it would otherwise have when we were importing 60% of our oil, which was the case not so long ago.
Mm-hmm. And Russian gas to Europe has a long story. It's in the news today, but it's certainly been in the news for a long time.
Well, it's certainly, when the poisoning of Navalny, the challenger to Putin, it brought it again, this pipeline called Nord Stream 2, which runs from Russia under the Baltic Sea to Germany, $11 billion project. It runs under the Baltic Sea except the last 100 miles, which last December was stopped by U.S. sanctions. So it continues to be very controversial. And one of the things that I found very interesting is going back, realizing that approximately for 60 or 70 years, periodically the U.S. gets into arguments with its European allies about importing oil or gas from Europe, from Russia, and it becomes a big controversy. And we're in one of those right now where, the U.S. Is considering possibly putting sanctions on officials of German government to prevent the pipeline from being finished. So Russian gas continues to be a very controversial issue. I think in the debates about it, what people lose sight of is whether the Russian gas comes through that pipeline or comes through other pipelines. Russian gas is going to continue to flow into Europe, but at U.S. LNG, it's going to compete with that Russian gas.
I remember early in my career going to visit a plant in Glasgow where they were building the gas compressors for Gazprom. That was back when President Reagan was having sanctions about.
Well, exactly. We put those sanctions in, and Margaret Thatcher, then the Prime Minister of England, said, how can you do this to a friend? Because the sanctions hit jobs and employment in Western Europe that was providing supplies. So that too was a battle over Russian gas, then Soviet gas.
What are some of the unintended long-term consequences from sanctions? They might work well in the short term and cause pain, but how does it affect the targeted nations, say, developing their own manufacturing, financial sanctions, risks to other currencies, et cetera?
Well, John, during that crisis that you mentioned in the 80s, when there was a fight about Russian gas coming to Germany, George Shultz, then the Secretary of State, made an observation that I quote in the new map that I think is very relevant. He said, sanctions are a wasting asset. Not always, but most of the time, or many times, countries find a way to work around them. They develop their own manufacturing capability. They circumvent it. There's a big concern now that sanctions has become such a tool of U.S. foreign policy, and they depend a lot upon the dollar system because payments flow through New York ultimately, and that's where the sanctions bite. And the question is, will they be able, countries that want to get around it, will they find an alternative financing system? And even Jack Lew, who was the former Secretary of Treasury at the end of Obama, has warned that if we continue to pursue sanctions just as knee-jerk reaction, we will create a situation where the dollar has to share room with other people, and no country is more keen to develop an alternative to the dollar than China.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads into another question around something you discuss in the book around the WTO consensus, and the two countries, U.S. and China, with 40% of the world's GDP and 50% of the world's military spending. Talk to us a little bit about engagement, strategic rivalry, new Cold War, and increased decoupling between the two countries.
I think that I invented this term WTO consensus, describing the kind of mood that existed in the early part of this century up until about 2015 or 2016, that China and the US were integrated in a world economy. It was good to bring China and integrate it, but that is really, that consensus has broken down. I live in Washington, and I'm struck by the degree to which there are very few things that unite Republicans and Democrats. One thing that does unite them is the sense that China is a rival, a competitor, that we have to meet this challenge. And there in Houston, you saw it symbolically with the closing down of the Chinese consulate. I mean, front page in the Chronicle, as it should be. It was a really important, not only action, but a symbolic action about interdependence. And so I think it is a big, shift, and we're in a different phase. Strategic rivalry, great power competition. Those are the terms that are being used right now. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure where people think this goes because China and the United States are really quite interconnected. I think many people would be surprised to find in their 401ks and their retirement pension plans that they own shares in Chinese companies. It's been a growing economy. It was growing at 6 or 8% a year. And, so we've seen the interdependence, but now it's kind of trying to break it. There's this view that we have a technology race between the United States and China. And of course, it carries over into other dimensions. As you know, John, one area I write about is the South China Sea, which may seem far away, but it is the single most important waterway for world trade. It may also be the most dangerous right now. And that goes back to the question of China claiming the South China Sea belongs to it. And other nations, not only the United States, but the other countries around there, Japan, Korea, saying, no, that's an open sea, freedom of seas. And I talk in the new map about several near collisions between U.S. and Chinese naval ships. And even now we see the rising tension. The U.S. Cabinet Secretary visits Taiwan, and the next day or two, Chinese jets and bombers fly over Taiwan. So I think the last few months, it's gotten to be a more tense situation. And I think it really behooves some thinking as to where it goes, because we're very connected. And, this is a real problem for global companies who have a playbook of working in a globalized world. Mm-hmm. And we see, I'm afraid, a kind of breakdown of globalization happening, not the end of globalization, but a more fragmented globalization. And at the heart of it is this situation between China and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the South China Sea is an interesting place. And I was actually there just last year, and we taking a look at some of the satellite overflights of the growth of some of the tiny, tiny islands or rocks even in that area.
Which now have turned into military bases.
It sounds like one of the biggest concerns for the Chinese is the ability for energy flows to move through those shipping lanes and their ability to keep the sea lanes of communication open for their use. Are there any other sort of major concerns around what's going on in the South China Sea from an oil and gas development standpoint or other trade?
I mean, the South China Sea is less than 1% of world oil production today. For companies, for the countries around there, it's significant development. But our own geologists at IHS Markit, and at least I don't know how the feeling is in ConocoPhillips, but in other companies, is that it's not very prospective of significant oil. It's more prospective of gas, but it would be expensive to develop. It would have some challenges in terms of producing it. So although I read these things where people say there's a treasure full of oil and gas, people may believe that, but I think, at least based upon what we know today, it's perspective in sort of a much more granular way. And that the main thing, I think, is the passage of, that's the main way China gets a lot of its oil. Dependence on imports. Oil the Chinese have seen as a strategic problem since the Korean War. And they actually used to get oil from the United States until that war started. And China now imports 75% of its oil, and they look with great envy at what's happened in the United States, where we've become the world's largest oil producer. So I think they worry about dependence. So I think that's one of the factors in this South China Sea, and an important factor.
Mm-hmm. We first met in 1999 at the launch of the Russian translation of your book, The Prize. Things have certainly changed a lot since then, and one of them that you write about is some of the oil and gas trade, especially gas trade, between Russia and the former Soviet Union and China. You share a little bit about your observations on where that is and where that goes.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Sometimes, you have to stand back when you're writing, you see connections. So what I saw was that at the same time that the U.S. was putting sanctions on this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, President Putin and President Xi Jinping had this very complex tripartite ceremony where they were in different rooms giving instructions to the control rooms on the border between China and Russia to start the flow of gas through this very large new pipeline called the Power of Siberia pipeline. It tells you what it is, the flow of gas into China. So while the United States is trying to prevent Nord Stream 2 from going ahead, that link between China and Russia gets even closer. There's a wonderful picture. I'm very proud of the photographs in the new map. And there's this great picture of Vladimir Putin showing Xi Jinping how to make Russian pancakes. And they're standing there saying, this is how you do it. While at the same time, Chinese, for this first time, had joined these very massive Russian military exercises that were taking place in the Far East. So all of that says is that that relationship is getting closer, and they're joined together by their rejection of what they see of an international order that has been historically dominated or shaped or led, I would say, by the United States. So I think that's one of the kind of, you talk about key geopolitical developments, that ever closer relationship between Russia and China. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Russia has not wanted to sell advanced weapons to China because they're afraid they'll be copied and reversed engineered. Well, not so long ago, the Russian defense minister changed his tune and said, we have to sell weapons to China. And I think that's, one of those that shows the change that's occurring.
Yeah, that's an interesting signpost to watch, that kind of change in international relations. So another really interesting part of international relations are the fact that there are the big three of oil and gas producers: Russia, Saudi, and the U.S. So in the long term, how much do you see the Saudis and the Russians cooperating on production and punishing shale production sometimes? Or do you see them more as threats to their own economies and optimizing production for their own fit?
I remember the first time when I went to Saudi Arabia in the early 1990s, then talking to the head of Saudi Aramco, who then subsequently became oil minister, Ali Naimi, I kind of said, just what do you think happened in Russia after the end of communism? He said, how do you regard Russia? He said, I regard it as a competitor. The reason, prices broke down in 2014, as many people watching will remember, and it was partly because of this disruptive technology called shale and the amazing growth in U.S. supply at a time when demand was weakening. But the critical point, and I described the scene in the book, was in a hotel room in Vienna, where the Saudi minister Ali Naimi met with the Russians and said, we won't cut back unless you cut back. And they said, well, we can't cut back for technical reasons. And he said, thank you very much, picked up his papers and left the room. And that was the signal for prices to collapse. 2 years later, Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, meet on the sidelines of a conference in, I believe it was China, and say, we really got to work something out here. And that was the beginning of what became OPEC Plus. So the cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Russia is really the new feature, and it shows it's OPEC Plus. It's not just OPEC anymore. Mm-hmm. The thing is, in end of February, beginning of March, that relationship fell apart, and they started an oil price war just as U.S., Europe was going into what I call an economic dark age, the shutdown because of the virus. And people remember not so long ago, negative oil prices. Mm-hmm. And it was the U.S. that stepped in. I have this great chapter called The Plague that describes it and talks about, there's Donald Trump saying, I've always hated OPEC, but I don't want to wipe out the domestic U.S. industry, see it wiped out. And he stepped in, and this was, maybe his biggest deal ever. But he was on the phone with Vladimir Putin. He was on the phone with King of Saudi Arabia. He was on the phone with the Crown Prince. And they put together a deal, which, John, you'll remember, is what really stabilized the price and got it out of the pits and at least got it back around that $40 price, which was, essential for the industry and very key to the well-being of Houston and Texas, and indeed to America's position in the world, I would say.
Well, your book has some really good insights into the start of the shale revolution with George Mitchell and Mark Papa and a number of other luminaries in the oil and gas sector that will be very familiar to the Houston crowd. But what were some of the things you learned, sort of unexpected things you learned about how that discovery of the shale revolution went through the industry?
Well, I think that what hit me was, first of all, the importance of stubbornness. And George Mitchell, as some will know, was really stubborn. It was like 16 years before they had the breakthrough. And it's that classic thing, you had one more try and they had to give up, and just how things came together, and somebody meeting somebody at a baseball game in Dallas and hearing about this different way of doing it, and that's kind of where the shale revolution started. And then, the people would say to George Mitchell, "You're wasting your money," and he'd say, "Well, it's my money." Well, it wasn't, it was a public company, but he had control of it. And, many companies would have just folded earlier. I think that was one thing. And then the story that Mark Papin, EOG, seeing that everybody was saying how much gas they're finding and how much gas they're finding and how much gas they're finding. And Mark saying, we're going to have too much gas. And then the question is, well, could you do shale oil? And I love it. Mark said, well, let's look it up. And they looked it up. No one knew how big an oil molecule was, and they had to figure that out. And then they did that, and that was the beginning of the oil side of it. So, I found just those stories of kind of how it happened, and, how technology comes together with individual decision-making, and these turning points I found just quite fascinating. And then, of course, the turnaround in realizing that the U.S. needed to be not an importer of LNG, but an exporter of LNG. And if we weren't exporting it, we were going to really have too much gas, and how people put that together was, again, just fascinating for me to tell that story, because it is a great American story.
Mm-hmm. Filled with some really interesting characters, too.
Yeah. Well, one of the great things about the energy industry in general is what interesting characters there are. I would say another surprising thing is we talk about the shale revolution. There's been another kind of revolution that's important, called the solar revolution, the degree to which the costs of solar have come down. But, when you look into it, you realize that's partly because of this Chinese manufacturing juggernaut that just has overwhelmed all other manufacturers of solar panels.
Well, you devote a lot of your book, a big part of the last part of your book, to alternatives of energy. And I still call them alternative, because I'm an oil and gas guy.
I got to tell you, John, we used to call them alternatives, but they're still small. I mean, oil, gas, and coal are 80% of our energy. Wind and solar are 4%, but they're growing fast and they have a lot of support. But so they're much more competitive.
Well, and as many of our listeners will know, that Texas leads the country in the amount of wind power, largest wind producing state in the country.
I know. I love to ask people, what state do you think has the most wind? And everybody says, oh, California. And I say, oh, no, you're wrong. It's Texas. And I think what was it? If Texas was an independent country, as some would like to think of it as, it would be the 5th or 6th largest country in terms of wind.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about the branding of clean energy. I'm seeing things in the press about responsible gas and blue hydrogen differentiating energy sources based on their environmental and greenhouse gas footprint. Is this sort of a riff on organic, non-GMO? What do you think about the movement?
Well, I do wonder about, and that's very interesting, the term clean energy. Because then that suggests that something else is dirty energy, and really, is that the way to think about it? And it's not looking at what goes into the manufacture of, solar panels. And one of the things I say, and it's a big area that we're actually doing research on, what we call the new supply chains for the net zero carbon future. Because, net zero has become, the goal for many. And, but people have not really looked at the supply chains for it, the scale and what's involved. China dominates the lithium battery supply chain, at least now, and not looking at how you're going to produce those minerals. So you know, I think in your career, John, you probably run into the term big oil. And would I say that if we really move towards this, you know, much more wind, much more solar, we're going to have a new, think about a new industry called big shovels, because it's going to require quite a lot of mining to achieve those goals on a scale that I think has not really been aggregated.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about the Chinese manufacturing juggernaut. So China was happy to join the 2015 Paris Agreement after a pretty famous one-on-one meeting with then President Obama. To what extent do you think are China's climate policies driven by business development for exporting wind and solar equipment? And what does that actually mean for intended nationally determined contributions from other countries?
It's interesting because just yesterday, President Xi at the UN said China will be net zero carbon by 2060. I think it's kind of pretty good to make a prediction like that because it's 40 years away. And, you know, why not make that prediction? You know, China has half the wind and half the solar in the world today, but it also is adding 3 new coal-fired plants a month. But I think China has identified what they call new energies and kind of made in China by 2025, and they want to be leadership roles in this. And they, you know, they have the leadership role in solar today. They have the lead, you know, in batteries today. I know one company that when all this trade problem, they wanted to stop importing their batteries from China because of the tariffs and the disruptions. And so they explored where else they could import the batteries from, and they found the other country they could import those batteries from was China. I mean, their position is very strong. So I think that an argument I make in the new map is that this notion that you have kind of here called clean energy, renewable energy there, and over here is something called geopolitics. They're going to come together. The geopolitics are going to be involved in these in these trade in this whole area. And I think the last few months we've seen, as I've said, U.S.-Chinese relations getting worse. And so we've seen what's happened with Huawei, with the technology companies. Now is it WeChat and TikTok? I mean, you know, why is it not going to get involved in the other supply chains too in terms of energy? So I think it's going to be a more complicated picture, and you can't divorce the geopolitics from it.
Well, that's an important theme in your book and a really good message that you communicate in it. One question that comes to mind then is about volatility and instability in supply and pricing. I've been in the oil business a long time. I've seen a good 5 or 6 oil price crashes. I probably have another 2 left in me before I retire. What do you see as forces that would increase versus decrease volatility in pricing and supply?
Well, you know, sometimes you talked about the Russian edition of the prize, which was called Dobrycha, which actually translated sort of buried treasure as the Russian title. And, you know, the prize has lots and lots of characters in that book. And yet at the end, I think there are 2 characters who really matter. One's called supply and one called demand. And I think that it's a commodity business ultimately, and it's a cyclical business, and investment and demand and changes in GDP, all these things affect it. And so, you know, we once did a study called The Perils of Prophecy about predicting oil prices. You know, kind of start off to understand why are price forecasts so often wrong. And it's because there are things that are not part of the oil industry that you're predicting, like what's going to happen to GDP or who. I only know one company that even had the notion of a pandemic in its emergency planning. I mean, this is just not there. And I kind of got into that question in that chapter called The Plague as to why this tragic pandemic was not anticipated. And I have some thoughts on that in the book. But so all of those factors are there. So I think volatility is going to be there. Something to watch for the future is that companies, owing to the pressure they're under now, have made major cuts in budgets. The major international companies have, on average, cut their budgets about 30% from what they were going to be at the beginning of the year. The large independents, many of them, most of them headquartered in Houston, it's more like 50%. So question, and this national oil companies are saying, so the question is, what is that going to do to supply 2 or 3 years from now? Mm-hmm. And there's not a definitive answer because we don't know what kind of economic recovery we're going to have. Are we going to have a feeble recovery because of the economic wounds? You know, all these tragedy of all these small businesses that just couldn't make it through this? Or are we going to be surprised and have a sort of strong economic rebound like seems to be the case in China right now? And that will determine whether this lack of investment, how it shows up in oil prices, and you know, and thus what the industry will do. But I think what the shale companies were already facing, and companies in general in the industry, was, you know, they have to give a return to investors. There has to be a kind of a new social contract, and that's you know, going to be a key consideration. So even if we do have a recovery, we're not going to see this kind of explosive growth in shale that we've seen before. We'd see with a recovery, I think we'd start to see modest growth.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for speaking with me today. I know we have a bunch of questions out in the audience, so I'm going to turn it over here to Ronan from the World Affairs Council for Greater Houston. And as always, great to see you, and thanks for speaking.
And great to see you, and I'm glad to see you have the classic Russian edition of the prize.
Well, thank you so much, John, for the wonderful job of moderation, and great to have the two of you who have connections going back, you know, 20 plus years to Moscow. And again, I want to say thank you so much, Dan, for joining the council again. For a long time, been one of our most popular and favorite speakers. And you know, as we mentioned in the book, many of you already have his first two, you know, well-known books, The Prize and The Quest. But the new map is excellent. If you want a great kind of overall summary of the major implications of energy and geopolitics of the last kind of 30, 40 years, it's all in this book, incredibly, and all in one book. But I think also probably one of the best things about this book is it's probably maybe one of the most balanced and I would say rational and comprehensive overviews of renewables and what is and maybe is not realistically possible with regards to the capacities for renewables and the outlook for renewables for the U.S. and for the global energy outlook going forward. So I highly recommend that to you. And again, with regards to the book, I know many of you may buy the books on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, but if you do want to buy it on Barnes & Noble, we have the links here in our chat section. And on the emails and our website. If you buy it from Barnes & Noble and in the order comment section, just put World Affairs. Very kindly, we will get it taken care of, that Dan will personalize and sign that book for you. So that's a great benefit. And for students, I know some of you are already doing it. We always love to have students attend. And anytime students, if you submit a question, if you could mention the high school or university you're attending, that would be great. I always like to kind of give you know, a kind of a shout out to the different schools that I attend. And, you know, maybe while the questions are coming in, I'm just going to kind of look at them and consolidate them, but maybe just something of a bigger and broader concern for Houston is, you know, for a long time, understandably, we've called ourselves the energy capital of the world, but in reality, that's probably better said that we're the oil and gas capital of the world. Do you have any concerns for Houston going forward in kind of mid and longer term? Not that something like Detroit would happen here with auto manufacturing, but maybe Pittsburgh and the decline of steel production in the U.S., that sure. I suppose the future kind of capital for renewables research and development hasn't been determined yet. In Houston, some of the majors have put a lot of money and effort into it, and some have not. Do you think people in Houston should be concerned that perhaps that, you know, 10, 20 years from now, Houston might be missing out if it, say, goes to California or China or other parts of the world, the kind of big changes in research in renewables?
I've had some discussions with Mayor Turner and others on that subject, and I think that, you know, what Houston has this great engineering talent, and sort of broadening it out would be appropriate. I don't think, you know, this oil and gas industry, I think, is here for quite a long time, but I think also we're going to have a more mixed energy system, and in terms of innovation in investment in creating a broader energy ecosystem, that would be beneficial for Houston's future, and it would build upon what it has. Ronan, I'd like to just say one other thing. I have great respect for the Houston World Affairs Council. You know, I have spoken at it many times, even when I don't have a book, and I think it plays such an important role because Houston is a great international city, and bringing those perspectives to Houston and also carrying the voice of Houston is a very important role. So I'm glad to be back again. So thank you.
Very kind of you. We're always delighted to host you. And as I mentioned, I love having student questions, and I'll open it up. One from Eve from Riley Farrell Academy asks, do you think big oil will become big energy as it becomes a major player in wind and solar? Or do you think upstarts like Tesla or others may become the clean energy providers of the future?
I think it's up for grabs. You see the European companies, that's a very good question, a very topical question, kind of rebranding themselves as energy companies, saying we're going to be big in electricity, we're going to be big in electric charging, we're going to be big in new technologies. So I think that's become very much part of their vocabulary. I think there'll be, Tesla is, an amazing upstart. I have a chapter about Tesla in the book, about the electric car and the conversation, the chief technology officer just talking about what an amazing story it was to try and start a new automobile company and how they had to be so ingenious. And maybe that could have only been done in Silicon Valley in that network. Tesla started over a fish lunch, which was supposed to be a lunch about electric airplanes. And according to Elon Musk said no, but he was interested in the electric car. It's a very good and a very interesting chapter. So I think it's going to be an open playing field. We see the same thing with the automobile companies trying to, how do they, they have their existing business, but how do they move into the new business? So I think it's going to be mixed. I think large companies have a much more of a focus on startups, on like venture capital than they've had in the past. And I think it's with that sense that, we're in a period of change, including driven by, among other things, digitalization.
Okay. And I'm going to, some of these, if I related questions, I might ask them together. Just two good questions on China. Nitin asks, do you see Sino-Russian access development as China intends to exert its dominance worldwide without having its own substantial energy resources? And then Jim asks, related to that, what are the implications of China's recent announcement that it will become carbon neutral by 2060? Can they do it?
Well, let me take the first part of that. China has put enormous emphasis on energy diversification. And of course, the Chinese companies had this go-out strategy to develop resources around the world. And it was, when we put sanctions a few years ago on investing in Russian Arctic, lo and behold, for the first time, the Chinese were allowed to invest in the Russian Arctic. So I think that relationship is going to get closer, and there's going to be more back and forth investment and relationship between Russia and China, particularly in this age of sanctions. The 2060 goal, I think China. It's been explained to me by Chinese that when they talk about climate change, they mean not only climate change in the way that it might be expressed in this country, but they also mean urban pollution, that the two blend together, and that China has an urgent need to address urban pollution. It's part of its social contract with its emerging middle class to deliver cleaner air. So I think those things fit in, and I think, going back to the electric car, they have roughly, again, I looked at the numbers, IHS Markit's automotive group, half the electric cars in the world are in China. And China is driving the electric car because they want to reduce dependence on imported oil. And also, as they see it, it's too late for them to compete with internal combustion engines. They're not going to, they can't get in the game unless they do like they did by Volvo. But they could leapfrog if EVs, and they want to be an exporter of cars that will be electric vehicles, so that they want to take a leadership role in that. So I think their climate objectives have to do with their economic objectives as well, has to do with their strategic objectives. But that agreement that President Obama made with President Xi in 2014 on climate, it was one agreement for the U.S., another for China, but that was essential for getting to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, which I think has become kind of a benchmark for many people looking to 2050, although China now has set 2060 as their goal, giving them a little more elbow room.
Okay. Okay, great. And I just think I might have misspoken. I was talking about the personalized signed book by from Dan. It's through Brazos Bookstore, Houston's own Brazos Bookstore. I'm sorry if I said Barnes & Noble by mistake. Another good
clarification.
Thank you. Another good question from C. Jackson, a graduate student at TUI, asks, how do we get to the world to see the importance of proper usage of minerals, water, etc., knowing how this may affect the environment, people, and so on? Which will be scarce in the future that could cause the most possible havoc in world relationships? Water, gas and oil, clean air, lithium? And can you talk about maybe the broader scope of minerals in general?
Well, I can't, address, ranking those things in environmental terms, but I think you're going to the point that I was kind of suggesting before, that if you're going to have a lot of mining, and by the way, mining, you use diesel fuel for mining, you've got to transport the minerals, and you have to do that in ships, and it's it's an energy intensive activity. And we're talking on a scale that's much larger than it is today. So I think that, those who are, it's called ESG, looking at, oil and gas companies, evaluating them on environmental, social, and governance, that will clearly be something that will also be applied to the supply chains for renewable energy, because ultimately they go back to digging, in many cases, digging things out of the ground.
Okay. Great. And a question here from Soma asks, what is your view on when peak global demand may occur for oil, given the recent outlook from BP?
That is a really good topical question, because BP's newest scenarios, I mean, they have more than one scenario, but the one that got the most attention was that maybe world oil demand has already peaked. Remember, it's a scenario. And, but there are others that, that it'll be a longer time. I think the view that I, kind of sifted through a lot of outlooks in our own thinking and research that I have in the new map is that most probably the peak is in the first part of the 2030s. And it doesn't mean that it just plummets. It means that it begins, kind of a decline but of course there's also a view in that we have decent economic recovery afterwards. I wondered if the BP or some of the other analyses are being influenced, by what we're going through now with COVID, and the fact that digitalization, what that means in terms of more, where work is going to be, how much of your office in the future is going to be at home, and does that mean less commuting, less time that people spend on, the highways coming into downtown Houston or wherever they're going, or do they only come in 2 or 3 days a week? Some companies are saying that, some part of their workforce will work at home in the future. And so commuting would go down and that would affect demand. We know that it's going to take longer for aviation to recover. We saw that. I have some, in the book I talk about both after 2008 and 2001, how long it took aviation to recover. And that shows up in jet fuel. So this year, we think world oil demand will end up being about 92 million barrels a day as opposed to 101 in 2019. I think there's going to probably be a pretty vociferous debate around peak demand, and people will be evaluating it, year by year as we see what happens. But it's important to remember the scenario. But remember, BP is one company now that says that they intend to produce less oil and gas in the future. Going back to that earlier question, make themselves more into an energy company and shift their capital investments.
Okay, great. And two related questions to LNG. Dennis asks, what is your view as LNG as a bridge fuel? Idea of kind of a less polluting option, especially for coal, as during a transition to more wind and solar. And then Sarah asks, regarding alternative fuels and ESG concerns, if Europe sticks with hydrogen or ammonia and the US sticks with LNG, how do we find a common ground?
Well, both challenging. First we have to say what gas has done to the United States. It's, our CO2 emissions are down to where they were 30 years ago, actually, and yet our economy is, more doubled during that period. And it's a large part of that is gas replacing coal and electric generation. That's been the biggest single factor. The view that we have is that LNG will, on average, grow at about 3% a year between now and 2040. It's in a difficult period now because of, even this year it's growing, but it's partly because prices are weak. So we think it will be somewhat of a cyclical business too, but we'll continue to grow and we'll compete for electric generation in places like India and Southeast Asia, and indeed in China. We'll compete with coal. Question about hydrogen is really interesting because, maybe 15 years ago, hydrogen was hot. There was going to be the hydrogen highway to the future in California. It ended up being the hydrogen highway that went nowhere. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, people started to focus on hydrogen again. And now it's become a really big subject. We have a hydrogen forum at IHS Market. We started about 4 years ago. Their interest is really intense because companies are seeing, well, does hydrogen enable them to continue to provide large-scale energy providers with something other than oil and gas? And hydrogen is a really big focus now, I think, of attention. Is Europe going to go? Well, let's say that, certainly it's probably a bigger topic of discussion in Europe than it is here, but I think among major oil and gas companies who use hydrogen in their refineries and other things, certainly something that is getting a lot more attention than it did even 2 or 3 years ago.
All right, and Diane asks, you talk about the impacts of companies and, kind of especially, I suppose, the marketing aspect of it, the public side of climate change concerns and how that may impact investment in oil and gas industry.
Well, I think that in the book, again, you see things when you're writing and you stand back and look at it. And in a sense, when it comes to climate, I said there are 2 eras. There's the era before the Paris Agreement and the era post-Paris. And we're now in post-Paris. And even though the U.S. has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, or is in the process of withdrawing, it's quite remarkable that 195 countries signed on to it. The goal to say we're going to keep temperatures from rising 2 degrees above in pre-industrial levels, or 1.5 degrees, and what do you have to do that? And that has become something that more and more investors have taken up. And the investors are asking companies, well, what's your strategy around that? How is your strategy? So I think the impact of investors on energy development is one of the really dynamic factors. And it's something that companies are, having to address and show that, that they're meeting these ESG requirements. I think part of the problem is that the ESG requirements vary a great deal from one evaluator to another evaluator. We created an ESG reporting repository to enable people to put their data in and everybody to systematize it and look at it the same way. So right now, I think companies get questionnaires from a dozen or more people asking, and then from individual investors. So I think you're quite right that investors will be, in this, looking at using Paris as a criteria, and the investors themselves are under pressure to say, what are you doing about the Paris commitments?
Okay, great. And another excellent question from a student, Ileana from Robert Gordon University, actually in Aberdeen, Scotland. If you're there currently, I think you win our award for furthest away in attending. Asks, how do you see the current situation of the major oil and gas companies with massive layoffs, salary and benefits reductions, cuts in CapEx? How do they survive this crisis?
Well, I think, this downturn is, you hesitate to say different from others, but it is different because this was really the result of, government policy response to the coronavirus. And it's been really rough, and the companies have really gotten into a survival mode, preserving cash, preserving their position. We know there have been a lot of bankruptcies of small, of some companies. There'll be consolidations. So I think that the focus now is on survival, and I think that we'll come out of it once again, growing, adding people. But I think it's really not till we get through this period, which for oil and gas companies, like for so many other companies, this is unprecedented in how difficult this is.
Okay, and maybe two questions related to China. Again, you touched on some before, but Michelle from the Baker Institute asks, can you please comment on China's strategic advantage on non-fuel minerals and how they pursued this advantage, what the implications are for the U.S. and the rest of the world? And then someone else asked, a similar question, trying to find it now, how does the U.S. compete, say, longer term, say, for instance, with China's grid, looking for the idea of, say, net zero grid for its electricity and all that?
Well, I think that, China has very consciously gone out to secure mineral positions around the world. And that's why you've got to look at those supply chains. That's why we're looking at them to understand them in a very granular way. They have been very thoughtful at what they've done, and it's been a national strategy rather than company strategy. You kind of see a wake-up now trying to catch up. Senator Murkowski of Alaska, chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, was one who was trying to shine a light on it. But I think it's only really happened more recently. And the second question was...
David asks, how will the rest of the world benefit from competition between the U.S. and China, especially when China has a zero-emission grid plan?
Well, their plan is, 40 years from now to get there. And a lot of things, I spoke to the Edison Electric Institute, the CEO conference, and a lot of the U.S. electric utilities have a goal of by 2035 or 2050 being net zero carbon. So I think a lot's happening. You have one candidate and another candidate, but a lot of things are just going to continue to happen. I think the U.S. has one tremendous advantage, and it goes back to that question you asked about the future of Houston, is we have a innovative ecosystem like none other in the world, starting with the 17 national laboratories, the $6.5 billion that the U.S. Department of Energy spends on basic science, by the way, under John DeBar's brother, Paul DeBar, who's the Undersecretary for Science, and then startups, universities, institutes, large companies. We have this amazing ecosystem, I guess we could call it, of innovation. And I think, that's truly one of our greatest strengths in this competition, and that people, you could going from basic discovery to people just being stubborn and pursuing things. And I think that's ultimately a great strength that we have, because ultimately the answer to all these questions are technology. It's not going to be regulation. It's not going to be this. It's going to be technology to provide the answers. And we have a culture and a system of innovation that has a track record of providing answers. And I think that's whatever you think about the situation now, I think that should be a source of optimism for the future.
Okay, great. And maybe a last question, just kind of looking forward, and also if you want to give any kind of closing comments. But Anita from Jane Long Academy asks, do you think what will be the next energy innovation in the near future, like with shale gas and tight oil? And if so, what might it be, and how far are we from it? Or what do you see as the big thing we're not thinking of?
That's a very good question, because, towards in the last chapter of the book, of the new map, I talk about all the surprises that have happened since 2000, and so expect to be surprised again. I could say the areas where it would be significant would be battery storage. Wouldn't be a surprise, because everybody's working on it and talking about it. Not everybody, but it's a big subject. The other thing I think that's really important is carbon capture. I think when you actually do the numbers and say what the goals are for 2050, oil and gas don't go away. I mean, no matter what anybody says, and I say that in the book. I said some people are not going to like hearing this, but so therefore I think carbon capture is an area, and whether it's so there's a lot of room there. But I think I guess we could say, what impact will digitalization have if life is organized around the cloud? Those are some of the things. But I think there's probably a surprise lurking out there that we haven't seen that will, change the picture again. And one of the things we should be prepared for and be resilient is to be prepared for surprise.
Okay. And again, I want to thank all of you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again at our future events. And thank you for the excellent questions, especially from the students. Always love those. And I want to thank again John DeBar for moderating the conversation, which was wonderful. And again, Dan's excellent book, The New Map, especially any of you who have his previous books, this is an excellent addition to it. And or even if you're new to it, it's a wonderful book if you want a great understanding of energy and geopolitics, but also kind of a balanced and I think kind of rational approach to the issues of climate change and renewables and how that will or will not affect the United States in a lot of ways. So I just want to thank you again for joining us. And again, my apologies. If you do want to get a signed copy of the book, it's on our website, and the email essentially is Brazos Bookstore, not Barnes & Nobles. You can also buy it there or Amazon. But thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank you so much, Daniel Yergin, for joining us again.
Well, thank you, Ronan, and thank the council, and thank everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you all. Goodbye.